Okay, so today I've been feeling really, really compelled to talk about this concept, not necessarily worldview, like we're going to get into that, which is why it's on the screen, but specifically just about the concept of logical argumentation and, and more than that, it's more than just intellectual. It's about the balancing of what I think are four really important words. There's logical, consistency, coherence, and then correlation. Um, and I just really want to touch on those. And then there's one more word. I also want to talk about justification. I just really think um, that those handful of words are just super important to touch on. Um, and the reason being is that I've encountered in my personal life and in like some of my social circles just this this propensity to have really strong opinions, which is fine. I think that's good, that aren't really justified or fleshed out, which is also fine. That's how most of us are, including myself. There are things that I have not explored that I might have a strong opinion on. I do my best to dig deeply into those whenever they arise. Um, but ultimately, there's gradations of this. Not everybody is at the same level. Not everybody really considers what they think or what they feel about something. They kind of just respond emotionally to things or purely intellectually to things. I think that there's a good balance of all of that stuff that needs to be considered. But ultimately, I think these handful of words are what I want to start off on. So what I'm going to get through, like everybody always says, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. The classic thing. So I really want to I really want to touch on a couple of key components, and then I think I'm going to do a series and walk through why I believe the thing that I believe. But I want to do it in a systematic, foundational way so that you can go back and you can say, he said this thing. He hasn't justified it. It's inconsistent. It's illogical. It's incoherent. It doesn't correlate. It's not. He hasn't justified it. I want you to be able to say those things because if you can say them, then I can evaluate them, and I can pivot and I can change. So I consider myself to be somebody who cares deeply about holding myself to this standard, and that doesn't mean that you have to, by any means. But if you end up here, you probably are somebody who does, or is at least wants to challenge people who feel that they do, which all of those things are okay. So let's start with what I think is a foundational component, and that is this concept of a worldview. Now, this term comes up constantly, especially in apologetics, and I personally think that most people who believe in a theological position, they tend to be pretty comfortable with this word, and people who don't tend to not really like this word, or maybe it's mostly used from apologists and theological people, and it's placed upon those who don't hold those positions. Um, and so they kind of feel almost like they're getting a label that they don't want. It's kind of like the word faith. How if you tell an atheist that they have faith, they'll adamantly deny it, and that's fine. I'm not trying to debate that particular component. It's just that same kind of a reaction, kind of visceral reaction to the word, I think. And I think it's got a lot to do with the arena that these words are used in. So that's fine. I want to make sure that I address things thoroughly and completely. And to say, this word, though, I think is applicable for virtually everyone. So over here, a worldview uh, or worldview is the fundamental cognitive orientation of an individual or society encompassing the whole of the individual's or society's knowledge and point of view. It can include natural philosophy, fundamental, existential, and normative postulates or themes, values, emotions, and ethics. So basically, it's the lens at which you interpret the world. So I think that this is virtually undeniable because governments exist, and pretty much everybody, even if you don't like your government, you participate in some capacity, whether it be at a small social level, even at your home. You have sort of like a home hierarchy, a home government, so to speak. So we all sort of view the world from a particular lens. And the reason I want to touch on this word is because I don't understand the aversion to it. Just because you don't have you don't have. I think people assume that because they haven't declared something, that they don't have something. And that's just untrue. Just because you haven't considered something doesn't mean you aren't doing something. So just because you don't have a Christian worldview, or as Christians would say, you don't have like a materialistic or a deterministic worldview, just because you don't declare them doesn't mean you don't have them. We all have a lens in which we look at the world and we evaluate the world. We do have a worldview. Whether or not you decide to explore that is a different story. You can never spend 2 seconds in your whole life exploring your worldview and have operated with one the entire time. You just didn't ever dig into it. It doesn't change the fact that you were operating with one the whole time. You're making claims about what is right or what is wrong, and maybe not, you're not claiming them, but your actions indicate them. So if somebody slaps you, you respond, and your response is through the lens of that worldview. You believe that slapping them back is appropriate, or you believe that smiling at them is appropriate, or whatever it ends up being. You're still operating inside of this way in which you have decided or just do interact with the world. So a worldview, a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world. Christianity, for sure, is the dictionary definition of a worldview. I would say that unequivocally. It's a totality, it's a total way of looking at the world. It gives you origin, meaning, morality, life, destiny. It gives you the whole picture, from beginning to end. It's a cohesive worldview. It might not be coherent, it might not be consistent. That's all fine. We'll get into that. But it definitely is this all-encompassing, like, cohesive worldview. It covers all of this stuff. It has opinions on all of these things. The next component would be logical. And so I'm going to do my best to hold myself to as many definitions as are applicable as I can. I want to be as thorough and as diligent as I can be. I think that in certain instances, like for the word, I think it was consistent when we get into it, there's a couple of definitions that we're really kind of staying more in the logical realm of things, but I want to be as diligent as possible and hold myself to the tough standard. So, according to the rules of logic or a formal argument, an example of this would be something like saying this statement is false, right? The rules of logic would say that that is a self-refuting statement because it has to be false to be true. So it can't be true, right? This statement is false. That's a truth statement saying that this statement is an incorrect statement, but the statement itself is saying that it's false. So it is self-refuting. That violates a rule or a law of logic. That's what people will regularly refer to as a law of logic. There are certain things that just because you can say something doesn't make that thing coherent or intellectual or intelligent or logical. It's a self-refuting statement. So that's a humongously important piece to this whole puzzle, is recognizing that just because you can express words, for example, if I said something like, I believe in determined free will, just because I can say that sentence doesn't mean that that sentence makes any sense, right? It doesn't mean that it's a logical, coherent, consistent sentence. It just means I have the capacity to express things that are incoherent. And so that's super important. Characterized by or capable of clear, sound reasoning. Those two are going to be important in this. We want it to be clear and sound and consistent. Of an action, development, decision, etc., natural or sensible given the circumstances. So all three of these I'm going to do my best to hold myself to, because this is about argumentation and thought process. So the adjectives, so logic being describing my thought process, my argument, those are really going to be applicable. Logical, yeah, okay, so that one doesn't really matter. Like exactly like pharmacological. Like we're not using it in that capacity. We're only using it in this adjective sense. Because we're talking about a thought process. This is describing the thing in which I'm participating in, the noun that I'm embodying. The next part is consistency. This is humongously important. And what I mean by that is, again, this statement is false, right? Not only is it illogical, it's impossible. It's a self-refuting statement, but it's inside of itself inconsistent. It doesn't even hold itself to its own standard. It's a truth claim that doesn't actually demand truth, and it requires that it's false in order to be true. So it's an inconsistent statement, just like saying, I believe in determined free will. That's, I can express it, but it's inconsistent. The determined means that it can't in any way be free, but then free will implies that it's not determined. Those are incompatible concepts. They're at odds. So unchanging in nature, standard, or effect over time, that's going to be one that we're going to be touching on. Acting or done in the same way over time, especially as to be fair or accurate. That's super important. That's going to be one that I really harp on. I want to make sure that when somebody asks me or challenges me, I can respond in a way that is consistent, fair, and accurate, the same as it iterates over all kinds of different scenarios and examples. It's compatible, so like I said before, it's an incompatible statement to say the statement is false. They're incompatible. The statement can't be true and also be false. Compatible also in the sense of, does it actually correlate, which we'll get into later. Does it actually correlate? Is it compatible with what we see in reality? And then not containing any logical contradictions, which is why I'm building the case in this capacity. So not in any logical contradictions, i.e., I believe in determined free will is a logical contradiction. It's inherently false, even though I can express it. So next, we're talking about coherence, right? So it's logical and it's consistent. This is a great word that starts to unify things and pull all those in. So you've got the two different words before that. Able to speak clearly and logically. So this is another really important thing. I want to represent my perspective in a way that is clear and logical. So you, when you hear me, you think that actually not only does it make sense, it doesn't appear to have self-defeating statements in it. It appears to abide by these rules of consistency and logic. Is it united as or forming a whole? So again, there is this set of reality that seems to exist. Does what I think or I say conform to that? Is it consistent with? Is it logical, and is it consistent with reality? So physics of waves having a constant phase relationship. Clearly, we're not going to get into that one. That one doesn't apply to this. Not saying that it couldn't. We couldn't loop in physics and bring it into this, but this is really just about the state of argumentation and the reflection upon your worldview and looking at how you actually interpret things in life. So we're going to stick with these two. I think it's fair, hopefully, people agree that I don't have to abide by three because it's not in the same context. It's a very different concept. So something that correlates, have a mutual relationship or connection in which one thing affects or depends on another. For example, logic, right? We said that coherent is logical and consistent. So these are correlated, right? Logic and consistent are correlated, and they help to make up the concept of coherence. Those are correlated. They are affected or dependent upon one another. They have a mutual relationship, a mutual connection. So coherence has a mutual relationship or a dependence upon consistency and logic. Establish a mutual relationship or connection between similar concept. Each of two or more related or complementary things. I think this is going to be kind of like a secondary, like a lesser version, but it is important, and I do want to hold myself to that, meaning that the things that I assert, they need to be logical, consistent, they need to be coherent, and they need to correlate, meaning that they're dependent and they create this sort of a whole, but they also need to be complementary in that they don't exclude one another or they're not at odds with each other. They unify things and they complement things, and one perspective and the other perspective come to and kind of like yin and yang, and they make this whole. They give you this full picture. So those are the four really important words, and then and to me, this is the most important thing that people don't really do. A lot of people understand logic, they understand consistency, they understand coherence and correlation, they understand all of these words, but they're not familiar with the concept of justifying something. And while these are all interconnected, justification to me is one of the most important components. It's the act of showing something to be right or reasonable, of good reason for something that exists or has been done. The act of declaring or making righteous. We're not going to use that. I mean, we can, obviously that has something to do with it, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the justification of a logical, consistent, coherent, correlated worldview. It's fun. You can assert all those things, just like I said. I can say this statement is false, but I can't justify it. Right? An assertion, just an empty statement of what I am calling a fact, an assertion of a fact without justification, is baseless. It's invalid. It has no merit or weight. Clearly, again, the acts or manner of justifying a lot. We're not going to use this one, and we're really not going to talk about this one until probably later. This one might come up later on in the series if I get around to that kind of thing. But these are humongously important words, right? We all have a worldview. It's easy to see that you abide by this. You interact with people, you interact with your work, you have all of these things, and you think that you should be treated a specific way. If a job doesn't give you a bonus that they promised you, you feel slighted. These are ways in which you view the world and relationships and all of these things, in which you take this particular perspective that you have on the world, and you take it into the way that you interact with things. The problem or the question becomes, when you look into it, does your worldview enable you to see the objectivity in a logical, consistent, coherent, correlated, and justifiable way? And this is tremendously important once you start getting into the realms of things like philosophy and apologetics and all of this stuff. You can deny that objectivity exists, and again, I can simply say this statement is false. You can say that is subjective. That's your own prerogative. You can say anything that you want. You can say that's not objective, but if it's self-refuting and it seems to inherently be untrue or impossible, logically impossible, then that seems objective. And if one objective truth exists, even one, that simply does mean that objective truth exists. It doesn't mean that the specific type of objective truth that Christianity purports is true. It's a non sequitur to say that. But if objectivity exists, one of the best examples for people who would refute theological positions would be science. If you truly believe you're studying the objective world and it is not subjective, and you are finding out true, like, mathematical equations that accurately, logically, consistently, coherently, and correlated capacities that can be justified, if you believe that you are discovering those things through science that are objective, then you have acknowledged that objectivity exists, unless you believe science is subjective. I believe that some of the interpretations are clearly subjective, but there are definitively experiments and things like that that seem to have objective results. There are things where you can say, if I drop this ball, it's going to fall and hit the ground. Unless, barring, I put a box in front of it or I do something that's going to violate that. But that would be called shifting the goalpost. The point is you set up a parameter and there's an objective result that keeps coming up. That's how science is done. That's how engineering and all of these things, like making cars function and everything. There's all these laws, the laws of thermodynamics and all this stuff. So, not to devolve too much, but effectively, I just want to point out that if any objectivity exists at all, then objectivity is real. So, anyone who wants to assert that everything is subjective, that's fine. That's my whole point. You can say anything you want. That sentence itself is self-refuting. You're trying to say that objectively, subjectivity is true, or all things are subjective. It's a self-refuting statement. It has no bearing. It's not logical. It's not consistent. It's not coherent. It doesn't correlate to reality, and it's not justifiable. So again, you can say anything that you want. Words have the ability to be used in whatever order, no matter how incoherently you want to put them together. It doesn't lead to a valid argument or a valid position or anything that is true or should be taken seriously. It just doesn't. Unfortunately, that's just seems to be the reality of the world. I'm not claiming this is objectively true. I can't tell you that I'm for sure 100% right because I haven't explored everything that is explorable. But this seems to be commonsensically logical, consistent, coherent, correlated, and justifiable. Everybody has a worldview. Objectivity exists. I'm not sure of the scale. In this video, I'm not going to declare the scale at which objectivity exists. I'm just going to say objectivity is real. Almost every single person in the world believes that science is like this new kind of almost deity kind of thing in the world. Scientists are like the rock stars of the world because they're discovering this objective reality that undergirds everything. Okay, that's awesome, but then objectivity exists. There's objective truths, and science, since it was founded upon philosophical propositions, not prepositions, propositions. It was founded on philosophical propositions, means that there are philosophical propositions that enable you to discover objectivity, which would imply, through logic and consistency and coherence and correlation, that philosophy has objective realities also inside of it. Otherwise, it could not have enabled science, the philosophical framework, to function properly. So by extension, you're proving, or you are logically demonstrating that it's consistent, coherent, and correlated, that philosophy by extension has objectivity also. Otherwise, the methods wouldn't work. So, again, this is going to be like a series about testing all of this stuff and being able to answer hard questions and being able to discover this kind of stuff. So I want to start with this, and then the next thing that we're going to talk about, I'm not sure when I'm going to do that video, but the next thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to use the word origin of the universe. You don't have to believe that it had an origin. I'm just going to use that word because I think a lot of people are familiar with that, just the topical phrasing of that. And so, I personally believe that what you assert or what you take to be true at the origin of the universe virtually determines everything that you're going to believe down the road, if you're consistent. Now, inconsistencies have infinite numbers of variations. It is impossible to... I'm not saying that you can't believe that the world is materialistic and deterministic and then say or act as if there is rationality and that there's objective moral truths and stuff like that. I'm not saying that you can't live that way. My point is you would have to find a way to justify it. You'd have to find a logical, consistent, justifiable way to say, I believe that the world is self-contained, but these objective things that I live in my life are still true. And if you can't justify them with logic, consistency, coherence, and correlation, then your worldview is probably wrong. That's really all this whole thing is about. And this applies to Christians too. For example, I have a video on theological determinism. They believe that free will is possible, despite the fact that God sovereignly decreed everything that you would ever do. You can assert anything you want. That doesn't make it true. I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just saying that's an example of something that seems to be logically incoherent. So, I hope you enjoy it. This is the first video. It's a little bit long. They're probably all going to be like this, if not longer, just to be totally honest. But I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that it's beneficial. I know this is going to benefit me in helping me to better articulate myself and even understand my own position better. So enjoy, and we'll see you in the future. Have a good one.